Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, CI 505. I'm very excited to be presenting Unit 4 on educational technology and equity. Now, all semester we have been considering how the impact of information and communications technology has on the larger society, with a focus on how digital media can support teaching and learning. We've considered the role that digital media can play in the expansion and development of new literacies, new ways of making meaning through multimodal interaction and participation. We've begun to consider the fact that through this digital media use, we are developing new ways of being creative and innovative. And now in Unit 4, these authors and these researchers ask us to consider educational equity. So they ask us to think about who has access to these kind of high quality learning opportunities through digital media. They ask us to consider the fact that maybe there's a chance that educational technology is not a neutral thing, but it's actually creating more opportunities for those who are already advantaged, and creating unfair learning outcomes for those who need the most help. So these four scholars consider basically how educational technology can support or can actually lead to greater unfairness, inequality, etc. So we begin with Neil Selwyn, and the title of this book chapter, Why Distrust Educational Technology, hints at the author's critique. And so he invites us to consider educational technology as a contested site. And he invites us to consider and to see with a sense of explicitness the ideological nature of educational technology use. So whose technologies are these? How are they being used? Who is benefiting? So we need to get beyond seeing just the pleasurable uses of technology or the most promising uses of technology. So he asks us to go beyond what he calls the state of the art to the state of the actual. So what's actually going on in these learning contexts? So instead of just being focused on the shiny new things or what he calls the old wine in new bottles, he invites us to consider the ideological agendas that shape what EdTech is. So it's not just an unequivocal force for good, but can actually be something that is harmful. So thinking about what education is, what it can be, and where does technology align or not with learning, requires us to consider the relationship between technology and power. In the second reading, which is actually a video by digital sociologist Tressie McMillan-Cottom, she asks us to think about what can access do for equity, what can access do for equality, and what can access do for justice. So in the first three units, we began to expand our unit of analysis from just the individual learner to focus on how classroom practices can support multimodal meaning making, and how social networks such as Twitter can provide new ways for learning via participation and supporting new social acts. In Unit 3, we considered how the process and systems facilitated creativity through language, digital storytelling, and things like that. Now in Unit 4, we are explicitly asking who has access to those high quality learning situations, And Khatam focused on who has access to open education and who has access to for-profit learning situations. So she considers, or she asks us to consider rather, educational expansion. And a prominent idea in sociology says if you expand education in a unequal society, such as the United States, education will simply reproduce those inequalities. So education is not a magic wand that can make those inequalities disappear. So we have to be strategic about how we're offering learning opportunities to all people. So she critiques the challenge or the promise of open education as democratic. She, like the other authors, ask us to consider the social aspects and the social context of learning. So she suggests, like Warshauer, Reich, and Ito, that those students in wealthier schools tend to use open source materials, oftentimes for more creative purposes. And those in lower income schools tend to use proprietary materials, often in ways that are de-skilled for the students, or de-skilling, I should say. So Khatam explores the idea that education cannot do it alone. Tools do not do it alone, but those who care about the tools, students, and education cannot abscond from participating in the political economy. So like Neil Selwyn, she asked us to consider the social, the political, the cultural, and the economic context of educational technology use. And finally, she asked us, who among us will be the keeper of openness and distance education, but also of justice? So the third article considers how did those in education design for equity? So we know that many of the educational benefits go to those in a high socioeconomic status, such as white upper class learners. So EdTech may actually exacerbate inequality. This is called the digital Matthew effect, in which those who have more receive more benefits, and those do not, who have fewer benefits often don't even have access to the material or social resources that would allow them to benefit. So in this longer article, they present a number of challenges for digital equity, and they suggest that EdTech is often oversold and underused, or that those in education often make really extravagant promises about what EdTech can do, and that is often used in ways that are not particularly transformative, so non-creative ways. At the same time, there are promising strategies that leverage high-quality design for learning, and those often involve a shared purpose. They involve aligned learning context, so aligning home, school, and community settings. They're connected to learner interests, and they serve their needs. So as researchers, we should create a rich collection of case studies that would allow us to see the complexity of designing for equitable learning outcomes. Finally, in the fourth article, we begin to see what is possible through the importance of relational equity. Relational equity involves the creation of learning spaces that not only acknowledge the inequitable power dynamics in education, but ask that those who have power reflect and reposition themselves in activity in ways that trouble the unequal status quo. So they talk about a number of models for learning in which Youth create expertise through joint activity, through a number of ways, through the apprenticeship model in which they develop expertise by following a more experienced other, as well as through joint work. So these authors, like a number of scholars that we've studied this semester, suggest that new media technologies, because they have low barriers to entry, because they offer opportunities for joint production, are well positioned to offer equitable learning outcomes. They mentioned two examples, one of Youth Radio and the second of El Pueblo. Youth Radio, they describe how youth work with professional journalists and those in media to learn digital storytelling, to design platforms, to collect data, and to develop leadership skills. And youth knowledge is valued at Youth Radio, and their stories often critique dominant narratives about youth. So youth conduct investigations, learn how to frame stories, and to challenge power relations in society. Meanwhile, El Pueblo is a makerspace that serves mostly Latina students through digital storytelling and making activities. This is designed as a university community partnership in which undergrads, mostly white pre-service teachers, examine their assumptions about social practices involved in teaching mostly Latina students. There's explicit focus on the design of learning spaces. So they look at the material, physical, and discursive artifacts of the learning environment and how learners participate in these activities. So material, physical, and discursive activities of the learning environment. So these authors suggest that through youth-led activities, as well as opportunities to develop expertise, youth, as well as adults, may develop relational equity, which is not just an understanding of their own power, but the determination to critically reflect on one's own power for the purpose of redistributing it to those who have been marginalized. And finally, they say we have envisioned a possible world in which youth produce new media tools and content side by side with adults to transform power relations among groups in society and work towards more just social futures. So with this, I would argue that they are suggesting that educational technology can be used to disrupt inequitable learning practices in and out of school, and to develop learning spaces in which youth expertise is developed, is valued, and is prioritized as something that will lead to or may lead to a more just and fair future. Thank you and have a good evening.